Welcome back to Talking Papers Faceless Podcast. I'm Shaquille.
And I'm Axa.
We're so glad you're joining us for another deep dive into some fascinating material. And don't forget, we drop new deep dives every Monday and Thursday, so make sure to hit that subscribe button and the bell so you don't miss anything new. We're really excited about today's topic. We're taking on Yuval Noah Harari's Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. It's one of those books that really makes you think about where humanity's going. You know, the big picture stuff.
It really does. It's like history and science and philosophy all kind of blended together.
Yeah, it's a really interesting mix. And before we jump in, we want to hear from you guys. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your thoughts or any topics you'd love for us to explore in future deep dives. Okay, so Homo Deus. One of the things that really struck me early on is how Harari talks about famine and plague and war, like these huge threats that have defined so much of human history.
Yeah, for most of our existence, they were these like uncontrollable forces of nature wiping out entire populations.
It's crazy to think about, right in the 17th century, during famines, people were eating cats and horses. I mean, can you imagine?
It's hard to fathom how different life was just a few centuries ago.
Exactly. And even diseases that we barely think about today were death sentences back then. But Harari's point is that we become so good at dealing with these external threats that we've set our sights on something even bigger, becoming Homo Deus, literally human God.
It's like we've conquered the basic survival game and now we're looking for the next level.
Totally. He's talking about immortality, ultimate bliss, even reaching a level of power that would have seemed like pure fantasy to our ancestors. But to really understand where he's going with this, you have to get this concept of intersubjective realities that he introduces.
These are things that don't exist in a physical sense, but they have a huge impact on our world, like money nations, even corporations.
It's like trying to explain money to a chimp. You know, a dollar bill doesn't have any real value to them, but it's the foundation of our entire economy.
Exactly. These intersubjective realities are essentially shared stories or myths that we all agree to believe in. And the fascinating thing is they've become even more powerful than physical reality in many ways.
Yeah, like Google isn't just a search engine anymore. It's like woven into the fabric of our digital lives.
Right. And Harari then questions whether humanism, this idea that's been so dominant, can really handle these huge shifts that technology and these intersubjective realities are bringing about.
It's like humanism, with its focus on individual experience and freedom, has been great for progress. But what happens when our feelings clash with each other or with these systems we've created?
He brings up this powerful example of Angela Merkel and the crying refugee girl. It's like this clash between individual empathy and the responsibilities of leading a nation.
It makes you wonder if humanism as we know it can really deal with the challenges of the 21st century. And that's where this idea of Dataism comes in.
Right. It's like Harari's suggesting that Dataism might be the next step, a new paradigm that goes beyond the limits of humanism.
Before we go too deep into Dataism, though, we want to hear from you guys. What are your thoughts on these initial ideas from Homo Deus? Drop a comment below and let us know.
And if you're digging this deep dive, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content.
We'll be back soon with part 2, where we'll really unpack this concept of Dataism and what it could mean for the future of humanity.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Homo Deus. So last time we were talking about humanism and how it might not be up to the task of dealing with these powerful technologies that are shaping our world, like artificial intelligence. And then you brought up Dataism, which really caught my attention.
Yeah, it just seems like such a huge shift in how we see ourselves and like the whole universe you mentioned, that it sees everything as data patterns. Can you unpack that a little more? Like, what does that actually mean for our lives?
So think about every thought you have, every action, every choice. It's all like a piece of data. And Dataism takes that idea and says that the universe itself is essentially a flow of information. And within that flow, the value of anything like a person, a company, a planet even, it's all about how well it can process data.
So it's like the universe is this giant computer and we're all just bits of code running inside of it.
That's a pretty interesting way to think about it, right? Our DNA is basically biological code. Our brains are processing information all the time, and everything we do leaves a digital footprint. It's all connected in this big cosmic information system.
Okay, I get that part.
Yeah.
But how does that translate into a new way of thinking, like a new ideology? What are the core principles of Dataism? How does it tell us to live?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because Harari doesn't lay out a set of rules like a traditional religion, but he explores what this data-centric view means, and it could lead to some really big changes in our values.
Like, for instance, how would Dataism change how we think about morality?
Good question, because humanism emphasizes things like individual rights and empathy. But dataism says morality might just be about processing information efficiently.
So instead of asking what's the right thing to do, we'd be asking what's the most efficient way to get a result based on the data we have.
Exactly. And that could have a huge impact on everything from how we deal with crime to healthcare to our relationships. Imagine algorithms predicting crime or AI doctors diagnosing illnesses with perfect accuracy.
It's like something out of a sci-fi movie.
I know, right? But it's not that far-fetched. We're already seeing this happening in lots of areas of our lives.
But what about the human element? What happens to love, creativity, spirituality if everything's just data?
That's a big question that Harari tackles, and he admits that dataism could create a dehumanizing world where we're only valuable for our data processing skills.
So it's not all positive?
Not necessarily, but he also says that dataism could give us new ways to understand ourselves and the universe. It could lead to amazing breakthroughs in AI and biotechnology, and maybe even help us solve some of our biggest problems.
Okay, so there are pros and cons, but this whole dataism thing still makes me a bit uneasy. I feel like we'd be giving up control to these cold algorithms.
I get that it's a lot to take in, but dataism is still a pretty new concept. It's not set in stone. We still have a choice in how we shape technology and what role dataism plays.
That's a good point. It all comes back to being aware and taking action. The more we know about dataism, the better we can make sure it serves humanity and not the other way around. And this ties back to Harari's whole discussion about humanism, right?
Right. It's like he's presenting dataism as both the challenge and a potential replacement for the humanist ideas that have been guiding us for so long.
It's almost like he's showing us the different operating systems that humanity has tried out throughout history and how they've changed as the world changed.
That's a great way to put it. And by understanding these different versions of humanism, we can better see how dataism might fit into this bigger evolutionary picture.
So let's talk about those different branches of humanism, starting with liberal humanism, since that's probably the most familiar to our listeners. What are its main principles, and how does it see the individual's place in the world?
Liberal humanism is all about individual freedom and autonomy, the pursuit of happiness. It sees each person as the ultimate source of meaning, and it champions individual rights and liberties.
It's like that classic idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Exactly, and this philosophy has been incredibly influential in shaping Western societies and promoting things like democracy, human rights, and free markets.
But Harari seems to be suggesting that liberal humanism might be struggling to keep up with these new technological realities.
He definitely raises questions about whether this focus on the individual can really address global problems where we need to work together and cooperate on a larger scale.
Okay, what about socialist humanism? How's that different from the liberal version?
Well, socialist humanism, as the name suggests, puts more emphasis on the collective good community and cooperation. It still values individual experiences, but it sees real meaning as coming from working together and sharing responsibility.
Like the idea that it takes a village.
Exactly. Thinkers like Karl Marx argued that individual self-exploration can be misleading because our desires are often shaped by our social class and background.
So instead of follow your heart, it's more like work together for the benefit of all.
You got it.
But doesn't that kind of clash with the whole idea of individual freedom that liberal humanism is all about?
Absolutely. And that's one of the big tensions that Harari highlights. Both liberal and socialist humanism have had trouble reconciling their ideals with the realities of the 20th, 21st centuries, especially with all these new technologies that blur the lines between individuals and the collective.
Okay, so we've covered liberal humanism and socialist humanism.
Yeah.
What about the third branch, evolutionary humanism? How does that fit in?
Evolutionary humanism takes a more, Darwinian approach. It sees human experience as constantly changing, shaped by the forces of natural selection.
Survival of the fittest, but for ideas.
Yeah, kind of. It argues that our values, beliefs, even our sense of morality are products of evolution.
But wouldn't that mean that good and evil are just random products of our biology with no real basis in any objective truth?
That's a question that has puzzled philosophers forever, and evolutionary humanism doesn't shy away from it. It acknowledges that what helped us survive in the past might not be relevant or even ethical today.
That's interesting. It's like our moral compass is constantly adjusting as we evolve and learn more about the world.
Exactly, and Harari uses the example of war to illustrate this point. Evolutionary humanism might see war as a driving force in human history, brutal but effective natural selection, but now most of us see war as a terrible tragedy to be avoided.
It shows that our moral instincts aren't fixed. They change as our knowledge and technology advance.
And those changes are constantly bringing up new questions and challenges for all three types of humanism.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack here, and we're just scratching the surface. If you guys are finding this as interesting as we are, leave a comment below. What are your thoughts on these different types of humanism, and how do you see them interacting with this whole dataism thing?
We'd love to hear your perspectives, and if you're enjoying this deep dive, hit that subscribe button and like this video. It helps us reach more people and keep the conversation going. We'll be back soon with part 3, where we'll explore what dataism could really mean for the future of humanity.
Okay, so welcome back to our deep dive into Yuval Noah Harari's Homo Deus. And, we've covered a lot of ground so far, talking about how humanity's overcome these huge threats like famine and plague and war, and how humanism might not be enough in the age of artificial intelligence.
Mhm.
And then there's this whole idea of dataism, which sees the universe as like this giant flow of information.
Right, and everything's value comes down to its ability to process that data. It's definitely a mind-bending concept.
It really is.
Yeah.
And in the last part, we were talking about how dataism could challenge the core principles of humanism. But now I'm curious about what it would actually look like in practice. Like what would a world shaped by dataism actually be like?
That's where things get really interesting and maybe a little bit scary too. Harari talks about a few different scenarios, and some of them are pretty intense. Like, one possibility is that we become super reliant on algorithms to make decisions, even in really personal areas of our lives.
We're kind of already seeing that happening, right? Like those stock trading algorithms that react instantly to market changes, or dating apps that use data to find your perfect match.
Exactly, those are early examples. But as these algorithms get even smarter, they could take on even more complex tasks like diagnosing diseases, composing music, maybe even running entire countries.
What, you're saying algorithms could be our politicians? That's a pretty wild thought.
Harari doesn't dismiss it. He says if algorithms can process data better than humans, they might be able to make more rational and efficient decisions without all the biases and emotions and self-interest that mess things up.
Okay, but isn't it dangerous to give algorithms that much power who would control them? And how could we be sure they'd have humanity's best interests at heart?
Those are some of the big ethical questions that dataism brings up, and there aren't easy answers. We're already giving up a lot of control to algorithms, often without even realizing it.
It's true, we trust Google Maps to get us places. We rely on Amazon to recommend things to buy.
Right.
We let Facebook decide what news we see. It's like algorithms are already shaping how we see the world and make decisions.
Right. And as we get more used to that, it's not a huge step to imagine a future where algorithms play a much bigger role.
So what about people who aren't comfortable with this trend? What options do we have if we don't want to live in an algorithm-ruled world?
It's a tough question. Harari's honest about the challenges. Dataism is a powerful force. It's going to shape the 21st century whether we like it or not. It can feel like we're on a train that's going too fast to stop.
So are we just stuck becoming slaves to the algorithm?
Yeah. Not necessarily. Harari also says we still have choices. We can choose how we use technology. We can demand transparency from the companies that create these algorithms, and we can fight for laws that protect our privacy and freedom.
That's a little bit reassuring. So I guess it comes down to awareness and action.
Mm.
The more we understand about dataism, the better we can make sure technology works for us, not the other way around.
Exactly. And that's what makes books like Homo Deus so important. They force us to think hard about the future and have these important conversations before it's too late.
Speaking of thought-provoking stuff, one of the craziest parts of Homo Deus for me was Harari's take on consciousness. He says it might not be as special as we think, and even animals might experience something like it.
And he even goes further, suggesting that AI could become conscious one day, which would be
Really mind-blowing.
Hold on, how could a machine be conscious? Isn't that something only living beings can do?
It's a question that's been debated forever, and we don't have a clear answer yet, but Harari points out that if consciousness is just information processing, then maybe a super complex algorithm could achieve it too.
Wouldn't that change everything we think we know about what it means to be human?
It would definitely challenge our assumptions, and it would raise a ton of ethical questions about the rights and responsibilities of conscious AI. It's definitely sci-fi material, but it's also something we need to think seriously about as AI gets more and more advanced.
It's funny, at the beginning we talk about how humanity's overcome all these existential threats like famine and disease and war, and now we're facing a future where the biggest dangers might come from our own creations. AI, genetic engineering, it's a strange situation.
It really is. We've accomplished so much, but we've also created new problems that we're just starting to understand. I think it reminds us that progress isn't always a straight line, and even when we're celebrating our successes, we have to be aware of the unintended consequences.
I think that's a great takeaway from this whole discussion. Homo Deus is a tough book, but it's so important. It makes us confront some of the biggest questions facing humanity, and it pushes us to think critically about the choices we make today.
So what's the main message that Harari is trying to get across?
I think it comes down to this. We're at a turning point. The decisions we make in the next few decades will shape the future of our species for a long time, and while we can't predict the future for sure, we can use our knowledge, our creativity, and our empathy to create a future that's both successful and humane.
That's something we can all agree on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Homo Deus. It's been an amazing journey.
It really has, and as always, we want you guys to keep thinking. Pick up a copy of Homo Deus, share your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going.
And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Talking Paper's Faceless podcast for more mind-blowing deep dives. We'll catch you next time.